Welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating piece of history. We're going to look at how warfare acted as both the crucible that forged Portugal's geographic identity, and then, centuries later, the hammer that ultimately fractured its modern empire. It's a sweeping story, contrasting hundreds of years of medieval conquest with an incredibly rapid modern collapse. It's all deeply rooted in the historical documents and data we're going to unpack today. So let's just get right into it.
We have to start off with a pretty provocative paradox. How exactly can a nation built by nearly 4 centuries of medieval conquest be completely brought to its knees by just 13 years of modern colonial warfare? Think about that for a second. We're going to break down the exact mechanisms of how the Portuguese state was built through this continuous expansion and why clinging to that exact same model in the 20th century became completely unsustainable.
All right, let's kick things off with Part 1, the birth of a kingdom.
To really grasp how the borders of the Portugal we know today were literally drawn by swords, we have to look at the sheer scale of the Reconquista. I mean, we are talking about a massive 381-year project. It kicks off way back in 868 when nobleman Vímora Paris seizes Porto and establishes the county of Portugal. Fast forward a bit to 1139, the Battle of Henriques, where Afonso Henriques routs a Muslim force and is literally acclaimed as king right there by his men. The momentum just keeps building through 1147 with the conquest of major hubs like Lisbon, and it finally wraps up in 1249 when the last Muslim strongholds in the Algarve are captured. So for almost 400 years, Portugal's entire geographic and political identity was being actively molded by war.
But here's the thing. This wasn't just some medieval land grab. It was fundamentally about political survival. In 1179, there's this papal decree called Manifestus Probatum, which officially recognized Afonso I as an independent king. But why did the Pope agree to this? Well, the document explicitly acknowledges his efforts in reconquering territory back to Christendom. For Portugal, pushing those borders through war was absolutely vital to prove they had the right to exist as a sovereign state. No war, no country.
Which brings us to Part 2, expanding that southern frontier.
You know, when we picture medieval expansion, we usually think of massive, pitched battles out in open fields, right? Well, actually, scratch that. A lot of the time, it relied on sheer cunning. The 1147 capture of the heavily defended city of Santarém is the perfect example of this. King Afonso Henriques simply didn't have the resources for a long, drawn-out siege. So what does he do? He pulls off a daring ruse. First, he sends Mem Ramirez to spy on their defenses, pretending he's just there for business. Then, the king leads a small strike force on a brutal 4-day march entirely under the cover of darkness. Before dawn even breaks, Ramirez and his crew scale the walls, surprise the sentries, and literally just open the front gates for the king. It was an absolute masterclass in stealth and psychological warfare.
And the psychological impact of this was massive. Just listen to this vivid quote from a Muslim chronicler from the era, Ibn Sahib es-Sila. He is expressing intense, boiling frustration over a rogue Portuguese warrior named Geraldo the Fearless, who was just terrorizing the southern frontier. The chronicler actually calls him that dog Geraldo, and notes how he was completely insensitive to brutal weather, using the wind and snow to his advantage to launch devastating surprise attacks.
So what was Geraldo's actual playbook? Honestly, it was completely unorthodox and terrifying. He specifically targeted cities on the darkest, rainiest, gloomiest nights possible, knowing the sentries would be hiding from the weather or asleep. He'd bring these exceptionally long wooden ladders to bypass massive city walls. He was always the first one up, and he'd grab the sleeping guards, literally mocking their night cries before his men poured over the walls to capture the sleeping city. Ruthless? Yes, but it was highly effective for pushing that border south.
Okay, keep all of that success in mind as we fast forward to the 20th century. Talk about a complete 180. During the medieval Reconquista, Portugal was cheered on and supported by international crusaders. English, Norman, and German fleets routinely stopped by to help them take cities. But hundreds of years later, during their colonial war, the exact opposite happened. Portugal was desperately clinging to overseas colonies while being universally condemned by the 2 global superpowers of the time, the US and the USSR. The international mechanism that had literally built their nation was now actively working against them.
And that brings us directly to Part 3, the eruption of the colonial war.
This is the modern quagmire that would ultimately tear the nation apart. Unlike those medieval days where war forged a homeland, this 13-year conflict was a desperate attempt by the far-right Estado Novo dictatorship to keep an overseas empire that was falling totally out of step with the modern world. Starting in 1961, the Portuguese government found itself fighting fierce independence movements across 3 massive distant African theaters: Angola, Mozambique, and Portuguese Guinea.
And if you want to talk about diplomatic desperation, get this. To try and dodge international heat, Portuguese dictator Antonio de Oliveira Salazar played extreme hardball. In 1962, he outright threatened to evict the highly strategic U.S. military base on Santa Maria in the Azores. This put President John F. Kennedy in a really tight spot. JFK had openly condemned the colonial war, but that base was simply too important for the Cold War. Ultimately, Salazar's threat worked. It forced the U.S. to turn a blind eye to Portugal's colonial policies just to keep their strategic foothold.
So what was the actual price tag of keeping this empire together? Let's dive into Part 4, the cost of empire.
Dodging JFK's diplomatic pressure was one thing, but the internal bleeding, that was something else entirely. The financial and human burdens were hitting an absolute breaking point. By the early 1970s, Portugal was pouring roughly 50% of its entire state budget into the military. 50%. Let that sink in. Half of the entire nation's financial resources were being swallowed whole by this conflict. Just to put that into perspective, that was a proportion 7 times higher than what neighboring Spain was spending on its defense during that exact same period.
If we take those historical numbers and adjust them for modern pricing, the financial toll is breathtaking. Over 13 years, the war cost the state between 21.8 and 29.8 billion euros. That's an unsustainable average of up to 2.3 billion euros every single year. This massive capital drain completely suffocated the metropole's economy. It starved domestic infrastructure, education, and development of absolutely vital funds.
But of course, the real cost wasn't just financial. The human toll was absolutely devastating across the board. The conflict resulted in the deaths of nearly 8,300 Portuguese soldiers, and the vast majority of those were young men sent directly from the metropole. Beyond that, an estimated 100,000 African civilians perished in the crossfire, along with roughly 1,000 Portuguese civilians.
All of this triggered a brutal domino effect back home. You had young men fleeing the country in massive waves, just to dodge the draft. Meanwhile, domestic social safety nets were completely buckling under the weight of injured veterans returning from the front. At the same exact time, Portugal was trying to rapidly industrialize, which was totally upending their traditional agricultural society. Throw the global 1973 oil crisis and skyrocketing inflation on top of all that, the domestic situation was a total powder keg.
Which perfectly sets the stage for Part 5, the Carnation Revolution.
This is where the crucible finally becomes the hammer. The Portuguese state hit its breaking point. As the fighting dragged on, the tension between the stubborn civilian government and a completely exhausted military leadership finally boiled over on April 25, 1974. All that systemic inefficiency, social unrest, and sheer war weariness culminated in the Carnation Revolution. This bloodless military coup finally ended the 13-year war, completely dismantled the Estado Novo dictatorship, and totally changed the trajectory of Portugal forever.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? I want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. Can a nation's identity survive intact when the very mechanism that built it becomes the exact catalyst for its fracturing? Portugal was literally forged by 381 years of continuous medieval conflict. It defined their borders, their legitimacy, and their spirit. But clinging to that very same imperial mechanism in a modern age completely drained their society, ultimately forcing the nation to collapse its own empire just to survive and reinvent itself as a democracy. It's an incredible piece of history. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and I'll see you in the next explainer.